This is update for October 21, 2023, day 605 of the war and of the date update. Also catch up for October 20th. As you can see, I'm going to start with more sort of financial economic news and discussion because it is affecting situation on the battlefield. It actually enables war or disables the war. And so, as I said, it's going to be first strategic update, and then I'm going to switch to the walks through the front line. I will do the front line. So, as you can see, this is data for the U.S. Government finances situation, which just came out, I think, a day or two ago. It looks pretty bad, and let me kind of walk through this, and then probably kind of tie it to how it's all related to the situation with help for Ukraine and in general situation in US, because effectively US is funding three wars. One war is obviously is not happening yet, but it's going in that direction in very clear sort of fashion. But the first one is war in Ukraine, and then the other one is war in Israel. So, and the third one that's yet to happen is war in Taiwan. This is the fiscal year, as I mentioned before. It starts on October 1 and ends on September 30th. So this is just finished fiscal year for the U.S. And this is so-called 2023. As you can see, the actual deficit is almost 1.7 trillion. So basically, this is receipts, this is outlays, and the difference is 1.7 trillion, and which is big and huge, I would say, and not sustainable. That's a more important part of it. And then if we compare it to 2022, it was basically 1.4 trillion. You can round it up. So that's again difference between receipts and outlays. The more important part in 2023 is you can see the collections, so tax collections for the U.S. government, federal. This is a federal government. It went actually down, and the source of it is individual income taxes, which I highlighted before, and it's a sign of pretty bad situation economically in the job market. And let me explain one more time why it is so. So if you can see, there's this employment and general retirement. This is the taxes that everybody has to pay, and it went up, as you can see, from 22 to 23, which shows that employment in generally is improving and more people are working, essentially, because this is basically tax on your salary, and it's more or less fixed for majority of the people. Where the problem starts to show up is in this income taxes, because this is to extent is your kind of like a profit, or I would say maybe not even ideal comparison is profit, but it's all driven by the income, by the size of the income, and the fact that it went down, and it's not small change. It just shows that those who are earning higher income, there are fewer of those, so which implies that the structure of job market is deteriorating in the US, where you have fewer well-paying jobs and more of sort of low-paying jobs, or it's a trend where it's all moving generally, basically, and that's a pretty unhealthy trend overall for economy, and that really could mean sudden crash and sudden problems economically straight ahead. And then the interest on the debt is 660 billion, and given that US, this is actually, this number in some way is understatement, and because US is having about 33.6 trillion of debt, at roughly 5% interest, that actually creates sort of normalized net interest expense of 1.7 trillion, which is a really huge number. This is obviously not happening right now. It's gonna be gradual situation, but because a lot of that was issued at low interest rates, and so over time that matures, and you have new debt issuances at high interest rate at roughly plus minus 5%. And the average tenor for the US debt is between 5 to 7 years. So, we already had 1 year. So, again, over the next 4 to 5 years, the interest on the US national debt is going to go significantly up. It will suffocate the ability to continue deficit spending effectively. So it's in a way kind of like restraining clause that restrains you from being able to do deficit financing, or there will be huge inflation if that's not going to be done. So in some ways, U.S. is heading into a very difficult financial situation within, let's say, 1 to 2 years, where it will the U.S. Parliament, because it's all passed, the budget is passed by the Parliament, as everywhere in pretty much I think every country is the same situation. They will have to reduce, or actually almost close to shut off deficit spending, right? And if you do that, that really means that we know it's 1.7 trillion, so you need to cut off from all of these expenses, find somehow 1.7 trillion, which is going to be not quite third, but let's say 25% cuts everywhere, if you do it simple way across the board. So that's going to be a huge pain that's going to be felt through basically through entire economy, because that's U.S. government is, as you can see, big spender. I think U.S. economy is about 24 to 25 trillion. If you look at this 6 trillion out of 24 or 25, it's roughly 25% of the GDP effectively. So that's going to be pretty, as I said, pretty painful situation. It's not going to happen, not happening right now, but that's something on the horizon and not so distant. And especially if there is, there is another war, with China over Taiwan, that's going to be really, can create financial chaos in the U.S. in the U.S. financial and economic system, and that's a reason why actually U.S. Parliament is not terribly willing to finance Ukraine and help Ukraine financially, is because there's obviously financially conservative part which is seeing this problem on the horizon, and they're attempting to sort of actively preemptively reduce all or cut off all expenses that are not absolutely necessary. And there is obviously part of the problem is because Ukrainian president and Ukrainian basically political top, they managed to spoil a relationship with the Republican Party, with their attitude and sort of being absolutely sort of one-sided. And it's obviously now, when things are difficult in the U.S., then the Republican Party is using that as ammunition. So in a way, it's a difficult situation going forward for Ukraine, where first of all, U.S. is facing its own financial and economic problems. Plus, it's multiplied by the absolutely misguided policies of the Ukrainian president, where he effectively alienated Republican Party. So that's sort of kind of like two hits in one, effectively. It's already affecting Ukraine situation with Ukraine financial aid. It's supposed to be 100 million for a year, basically for the 2024 fiscal year. Now the U.S. Government, or I guess U.S. president, seeing that that's not going to pass, they reduced it to 61 billion. So as you can see, it's 40% reduction. It's significant cut for Ukraine. Uh, Having said that, to be fair, a lot of this help was misused, and there's tons of rampant corruption in Ukraine. I mentioned this before, so so this is also understandable. That's that part, and in ideal situation, when everything works perfectly and there is no corruption and theft of the funds, 61 billion is still enough and plenty. Um, and on top of it, Ukraine is still getting help from the EU, which I believe is something very similar in number. So effectively, between these two numbers, Ukraine is getting its close to pre-war GDP. And this is basically right away financial help. Obviously, the expenses are much higher related to the war, but at the same time, a lot of other expenses are gone as well. So in some way, it's compensated. Um, but going forward, it's very clear Ukraine is going to be facing difficult financial situation. There's no, especially given that there will be no changes in this sort of desire for corruption, for theft of public funds in the Ukraine. That's what's really where the biggest problem for Ukraine, for its survival, basically. Not actual reduction of the funds in the US. Now let's actually switch a little bit closer um, to the war. I'm gonna talk a little bit about uh, Russian missiles, specifically Kaliber and Iskander, that they are using, and this is basically brain of that of those missiles, as you can see here, uh, and it's effectively all of this. Processors, they are made in Russia. Basically, it's Russian design and everything. They are totally not sophisticated, but that's why you have a lot of them, and it's big, but it works. That's the whole point, that this works, and that's an answer why Russia will not have shortage of the missiles to attack Ukraine, because there was a lot of, especially at the beginning of the war, there was a lot of propaganda. Russia will about to, run out of rockets to hit Ukraine. That's and I mentioned at that time it wasn't true, and I think this is another sort of more specific factual explanation why it's not happening is simply because Russia is capable of producing electronics for those rockets, and obviously producing the rockets themselves is not a problem for Russia. So they fully independent, they don't rely on anyone, so they can sort of continue manufacturing it as long as it's needed. The only is just the throughput capacity at the factory. That's the only truly, and it's sort of the only limiting factor, and the one that could be fairly quickly adjusted. In terms of the fact that this is sort of, I would say, I don't know, Pentium 1, 2, or 3, or 4, whatever type of computer, it's actually probably for many people it will be surprised, but in military application, most of the computers or brains are actually at the level, or that level, like Pentium computer type of stuff. That's like 20 years old. Even, for example, like U.S. Jet fighters such as F-35, it basically has old school, very not powerful computer relative to what we actually sort of we have, and I would say even probably your personal computer that you're using. is, as long as it's sort of at least medium range and not the cheapest one, is probably much better than anything you will see on military applications. And the reason for that is because their reliability is much more important, and attempt to make it everything super reliable makes computer much more expensive, and sometimes it's absolutely unnecessary. It's just too much emphasis on the reliability. I'm not saying it shouldn't be reliable, but it just overdoing it basically to the point that there is clearly room to kind of move in other direction, and then everything becomes very expensive. Plus, there is monopolism in manufacturing, so they try just use old school stuff because it's very well known and sort of reliable. So, from that perspective, for most military applications, you essentially don't need anything cutting edge, pretty much at all. And from that perspective, the another sort of thought that comes from it is what China actually has is completely sufficient for the war. They really don't need this, 2, 3, 4 nanometer technology to actually wage the war and actually successfully wage the war. Because what the US is using is probably also like 28 nanometer or even worse. So, and that's what Russia has, and that's what China has plenty of it. There is also everybody probably read news that China started making chips in 7 nanometers. So effectively, China has plenty to actually to be totally competitive. Where it's may affect situation is artificial intelligence, but it's to be fair, it's not fully utilized by the West at all in terms of the computing power, everything, and it really requires, I would say, extreme level of expertise and ownership, which is lacking in the West. It's lacking in China and Russia. So it's effectively something that's potentially useful on the military battlefield, but it's just because it's government bureaucracy, it's just not going to be effectively, efficiently utilized probably ever, and so it's out there, but nobody's effectively using it. Not to mention that a lot of it is in the first place overblown. However, from like purely military perspective, there is definitely quite a bit of actually practical applications. They're going to be expensive, but because the strengths of AI, which is not really AI, just basically sophisticated algorithms that's basically created by people. There's nothing truly AI. There's no true artificial intelligence. But so where going back to where that's applicable, where they have extremely strong is in visual detection, in basically working with all sorts of images, and that's something that's obviously, there's tons of images generated on battlefield. You can train it. They do require a lot of training data, like just huge amount of training data to be somewhat close to be at least sort of usable. So that's another huge hurdle and problem that pretty much nobody has enough of this basically images, which is training material, because you really need to train those algorithms, and they require a lot of training material to become fairly usable. So in some ways, it's just I would say hype more than anything, and it's expensive. Like doing all of that training, the whole infrastructure is expensive. So it's anyways only very select few applications where it can be used and it's makes sense. But for the most stuff for the war, it's complete overkill and totally unnecessary. Sorry for this such a long explanation, but hopefully it helps to understand that there is really not much of a barrier, especially for China, to be successful on the battlefield against the West and obviously US, first of all, because that's sort of the main counterparty, let's put it this way. Now let's move to Ukraine, and I'm gonna do walks through the front line as I always do in a clockwise fashion. Starting from very north, situation along the state border remains the same, stable. I would say fairly stable, much more quieter than it used to be. Now let's move to North Lugansk front line. Things here are essentially the same without many changes. Some Russian tactical attacks just purely to put pressure on Ukrainian forces. Uh, they don't have anything sort of to write home about. Situation remains status quo. Now let's move to North Donbass front line. The northern sector more or less quiet, nothing particular here. The southern as well, just tactical attacks. That actually interesting. Sort of, there was an interesting interview by the head of the Azov brigade, and he finally openly admitted that Arlan 10 is a big problem. It's essentially a huge strategic advantage that Russia has over Ukrainian forces, and basically it disrupts any attempt to have any offensive or even large-scale attack. And that's why that essentially that's really answers for those who are interested why in the first place attacks in on the Zaporizhya front line failed, and that's not the only reason, but that's, let's say, it explains probably 50-60% of the problem, at least from what Russia did right. Let's put this way. There's also interesting comparison. So he said that Western equivalents are all worse than Arlan 10. Which is, if you recall, there was a lot of propaganda laughing how they made from, homemade parts and everything, and yet I would say that's example of actually excellent engineering, and not only engineering, but also economically properly engineered from economic perspective, because unfortunately most Western military equipment is extremely poorly engineered from economic perspective. Essentially, it's almost barely usable. Let's put this way. And Arlan 10 is completely opposite of that. And Russia has a lot of them. So just in that interview, he was just bringing example that they would have over a short section of the front line, essentially 10 to 11 of those. So you can imagine how saturated the front line with Arlans, and essentially Russian command has nearly a real-time view of the entire front line. It's more of a question of having enough high quality analysts to analyze the situation, but they have fully data that they need to be sort of on top of the situation. The sort of lucky part that they cannot use it effectively due to limitation of the Soviet army, which is what Russian army is. So that's really the saving grace for Ukraine. Otherwise, it would be disaster. Now let's move to the central Donbass front line. Things here are sort of similar. Russia is continuing putting pressure around Avdiyivka with the end goal of capturing Avdiyivka. This is what I showed before. The situation along this coal waste heap is always changing. Effectively, Russian troops trying to capture it, then they lose it, then Ukrainian forces lose it, and it's essentially changing hands. Effectively, it's kind of like remaining no man's land. because it's neither side is capable of establishing full control of it. From Ukrainian perspective, as long as Russian side is not controlling it, it's effectively success, and Russia is not going to be able then to utilize it, and they're not going to get any advantage. The other part of this whole Russian small-scale attack is that they lost a lot of equipment. Don't have numbers, but it's a huge number of equipment that's being lost, comparable to what Ukraine lost for the entire summer, and that's effectively makes it nearly impossible to do any true large offensive for Russian forces through the winter, essentially. They also had heavy losses people-wise, but that's not as sort of painful, and nothing, it's not comparable to the equipment losses. That's really where the biggest problem is. Obviously, Ukrainian side is having heavy losses in people. It's in defensive, so the equipment losses are fairly extremely limited. But because it's infantry versus infantry attacks, and obviously there are losses on the Ukrainian side. There is no question about it. But the sort of strategic importance of all of this, it's effectively in some way strategic defeat for Russia, because it's took away possibility to do any large scale offensive, unless obviously there is some kind of hidden card in the pocket of Russian military, but so far that's what's the most likely scenario. There's also, I want to mention that on the Russian media, there is they proudly circulating pictures of the shells from North Korea. It's actually unclear if they actually got it or it's just propaganda machine working. So I wouldn't say that they actually have it. It seems to be that's going that way, but if, let's say, the factual evidence does not fully support that case, let's put this way. Now let's move to the Zaporizhya front line. Things here are more or less quiet, just tactical squeezes or pushes by Russian troops. Mostly they focus now around this area, around Velika Novosilka, without any meaningful success. And effectively, I would say the situation kind of changed on the front line, where the Zaporizhia front line is becoming in some ways secondary, and the focus is Avdiyivka, and effectively Russian command is having initiative from that perspective. Plus, actually, another focus area is a situation along Dnipro River, where it seems that Russian troops are having actually really trouble containing Ukrainian forces. So Ukrainian forces establish another bridgehead near village Krynky, which is where I'm showing. So it seems that there are bridgeheads that's being actively established, and hopefully that's going to be used as an opportunity to actually do offensive, which is Ukraine is so unfortunately not capable of doing, but at least attack and sort of this probably the most realistic opportunity for Ukrainian side, and in some way I may actually sort of backdate and say that October 16, when Ukrainian forces actually established another bridgehead, and Ukrainian forces also attacked Russian airfield in Berdyansk with ATACMS missile. That probably means that's a sort of second attempt at offensive by Ukrainian command. The first one, for reminder, was on June 4th, and it lasted for a couple months, and I would say miserably failed. And so this is another. This seems to be. I cannot say it for sure, but this might be another attempt to do the same. And Unfortunately, if it's not going to be done in a decisive way, similar how it's being done in the summer, that's going to be the same result. But at least the location seems to be much more logical, much more sort of intelligently selected. We'll see if this leads to anything meaningful in the coming sort of weeks. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Until next time.